Welcome to this lesson on analyzing persuasive techniques. This is an advanced lesson that builds on everything you already know about author stance, rhetorical devices, and evidence evaluation. In earlier lessons, we learned to identify what techniques an author is using. Now we go deeper. The question is no longer what is the author doing, but is it actually working? Is the argument strong or weak? Is the persuasion fair or manipulative? By the end of this lesson, you will be able to pull apart an argument and judge its overall strength. Here is what we will cover. First, how to evaluate whether persuasive techniques are being used effectively or manipulatively. Then, how to identify loaded language, which is word choice designed to trigger emotional reactions. We will learn to spot one-sided arguments where the author ignores opposing views. And finally, how to assess the overall strength of an argument by pulling together everything you know about evidence, logic, and technique. This lesson builds on earlier ones. You should already be able to identify rhetorical devices, author stance, and evidence types. Now we are evaluating whether those things actually make a convincing case. Loaded language uses emotionally charged words to influence how you feel before you have even considered the evidence. Look at the loaded version on screen. Reckless, devastate, abandon, vulnerable. Every word is chosen to provoke outrage. Now, look at the neutral version. Negative effects, disproportionately affect, lower income residents. Same basic claim, but without the emotional push. Loaded language is not always wrong. Sometimes the situation genuinely calls for strong words. But the critical question is this: strip away the emotional words and ask what is actually being claimed. Is there evidence to support that claim, or is the language doing all the heavy lifting? If the argument falls apart without the loaded language, it was never strong to begin with. A one-sided argument presents only evidence that supports the author's position while ignoring or dismissing anything that contradicts it. There are 4 signs to watch for. First, no opposing view is mentioned at all. The author writes as though no reasonable person could disagree. Second, counter-arguments are mentioned, but immediately dismissed without proper engagement. Something like some claim X, but this is clearly wrong, with no explanation of why. Third, only favorable evidence is cited while inconvenient data is ignored. And fourth, absolute language like always, never, every, and no one with no qualification. Here is the key insight. A strong argument acknowledges the other side and explains why its own position is still stronger despite the counterpoints. A weak argument pretends the other side does not exist. When you need to assess the overall strength of an argument, use this 5-point checklist. First, evidence quality. Is the evidence specific, sourced, recent, and relevant? Or is it vague and unsourced? Second, logical reasoning. Do the conclusions actually follow from the evidence? Or are there gaps where the author jumps from A to C without explaining B? Third, balance. Does the author acknowledge counter-arguments, or is it entirely one-sided? Fourth, language. Is the tone measured and fair, or does it rely heavily on loaded words and emotional appeals? And fifth, source credibility. Are the sources trustworthy and relevant, or do they have obvious conflicts of interest? The strong argument scores well on all 5. A weak argument typically fails on multiple counts. Let us analyze some loaded language. The passage describes the council's decision to close a community center using words like outrageous, furious, betrayed, heartless, and destroy. How does this language affect the argument? It appeals to emotion rather than presenting evidence. Notice what is missing. Why did the council make this decision? What data exists about actual usage of the center? Are there alternative plans? The passage does not address any of this. It tells you how to feel, but gives you no facts to base that feeling on. That does not mean the council's decision was right. It means this particular argument is weak, because it substitutes emotion for evidence. Now let us evaluate a stronger argument using our checklist. The passage discusses a program, acknowledges its critics, and presents evidence from a 5-year study. Let us go through the checklist. Evidence quality, strong. It cites a specific study, names the institution, and gives an exact percentage. Logical reasoning, strong. The conclusion that the program is worth funding follows logically from the employment data and cost recovery data. Balance, strong. The author acknowledges that some researchers have questioned the program and that critics correctly point out high costs. These are real concessions, not dismissals. Language, strong. The tone is measured. The phrase on balance signals a fair assessment of both sides. Source credibility, strong. The National Institute conducted a formal 5-year study. This is a well-constructed argument that scores well across all 5 criteria. Let us spot a one-sided argument. The passage claims remote working is clearly the future, citing higher satisfaction, cost savings, and increased productivity. Then it says there is simply no reason to return to offices. What is missing? First, the challenges of remote work are completely ignored. Isolation, difficulties with collaboration, blurred work-life boundaries. These are well-documented concerns, and the author pretends they do not exist. Second, the evidence is vague. Has been shown by whom? Employees report, but which survey? Third, the language is absolute. Clearly and simply no reason to dismiss all counter-arguments without engaging with any of them. A stronger version of this argument would acknowledge these challenges and explain why the benefits still outweigh them. Your turn. Pause and evaluate each passage. Question 1. Everyone knows that social media is harmful to young people, and we should ban it entirely. This uses an appeal to consensus with everyone knows, loaded language with harmful, and proposes an absolute solution with banned entirely. No evidence is cited at all. This is a weak argument on every count. Question 2. Although initial results are promising, Dr. Nguyen cautions that the sample size limits the conclusions. This is balanced and cautious. It names an expert, acknowledges limitations, and does not overclaim. Even though it does not make a strong positive case, the honesty makes it credible. Question 3. Identify the loaded language, and bureaucrats have once again ignored the desperate pleas of hardworking families. Almost every word is loaded. Bureaucrats is negative framing. Once again implies a pattern. Desperate pleas is emotional. Hardworking is sympathetic framing. Let us recap. Loaded language uses emotionally charged words to influence your reaction before you have considered the evidence. The key skill is to strip it away and see what is actually left. One-sided arguments ignore opposing views. Strong arguments acknowledge counterpoints and explain why their position is still stronger. Use the 5-point checklist: evidence quality, logical reasoning, balance, language, and source credibility. Absolute language, like always, never, clearly, and obviously, is a red flag. And remember, a strong argument can survive having its emotional language removed. A weak one collapses without it. The ultimate test is this: rewrite the argument using only neutral language and factual claims. If it still makes sense, the argument is genuinely strong. If it falls apart, the persuasion was doing all the work, and there was no real substance underneath.